This event is supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. My colleagues, Dr. Gabriela Baeza Ventura, Executive Editor of Arte Público, and Dr. Carolina Villarreal, Brown Foundation Director of Research at Recovery, founded the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Program with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we're happy to report that we have made important strides in this field. We'd like to thank our Mellon Program Officer, Dr. Patricia Shui, for her guidance and support. We have grown our team to include Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant, and together we organize talks and workshops on DH and social justice, present on conferences across the US, train and mentor students from all academic levels as well as community members on US Latino digital praxis, create digital projects and data sets. We also recently awarded the second cohort of 9 grants in aid for the US Latinx Digital Humanities projects, over $65,000, and we also offer training. All this work has solidified our USLDH program as one that continues to work on the US Latino written legacy that has been lost, absent, repressed, or underrepresented. I invite you to visit our website at artepublicopress.com for more information, to follow us on social media, and use the hashtag USLDH when you post about US Latino, and Latinx DH. Before I introduce Claire Jimenez, I'd like to go over a few logistics for Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat function to type in your questions. We will share your questions with her at the end so that she can answer them. And lastly, please mute yourselves to cut down on background noise. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's speaker. Claire Jimenez is a Puerto Rican writer who grew up in Brooklyn and Staten Island, New York. She is the author of the short story collection Staten Island Stories, which received the 2019 Hornblower Award for a first book from New York Society Library and was a finalist for the International Latino Book Awards. Jimenez is a PhD student in English with a concentration in ethnic studies and digital humanities at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She received her MFA from Vanderbilt University. Recently, she was a research fellow at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, and in 2020, we awarded her a USLDH Mellon Foundation grant in aid to develop the Puerto Rican Literature Project. Together with a team of other Puerto Rican writers and scholars and USLDH, she recently received an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Presidential Initiative grant to help develop this digital archive. She is currently an assistant fiction editor at Prairie Schooner. Her fiction, essays, and reviews have appeared in Remezcla, Afro-Hispanic Review, Pank, The Rumpus, El Roommate, Leader, District Lit, The Toast, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other publications. Claire has graciously offered to donate her honorarium today to help support USLDH student research fellows so that we continue to build this community together. Please join me in welcoming Claire Jimenez today.
Thank you so much, Lorena. I love USLDH. USLDH has taught me so much, and it's a pleasure to be in such company and such family. I see Vero here too. She goes to UNL with me. So I'm going to actually share PowerPoints, and before I do that, forgive me. I know PowerPoints for me are the quickest way to get me to not listen, but I'm going to try to actually make this as interactive as possible, even if you don't have to speak up or share, because I understand we're getting recorded, so it might be like a little bit nerve-wracking to do that. But I am going to ask you to sort of think through things on your own. Maybe you'll want to write. You might, if you're interested in that, you might want to get a notebook or a pen, or you could just meditate and think through these questions. Okay, so I'm actually going to begin with a little exercise. All right, and this might be a moment to take out that pen and paper. If you want, you can just reflect off the page. And I'm going to begin with an exercise that we often do in youth development. And it's youth development, obviously, is a field in which there's a lot of like youth activities or projects. Basically, it's about empowering youth. And this exercise is commonly used because it helps people think about what it was like to be young. Because as we get older, we forget. And so it's a really important exercise to kind of put us back into that mindset. So can everybody see this? Okay, good. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions. I want you to picture yourself when you were 13 years old. Where did you go to school? What grade were you in? What year was it? Was it 1996, 1985, 2003? Try to really remember what was going on at that time around you. What songs were on the radio? What movie was everybody talking about? Take a minute to think about this before we move on to the next slide. Now I want you to think about, who did you chill with? What did your best friends talk about? Who were your enemies? What slang did you and your friends use? What secrets did you keep? As a 13-year-old, what did you want more than anything in the world? I remember when I was 13, I wanted this really nice pair of jeans that was $30, which in the 90s seems like it was a lot of money, right? And so, but I couldn't get those jeans, and I would kind of fixate on them. I would think about them a lot. What were you most afraid of? Who did you want to be when you grew up? How did you feel about school? What songs did you keep close to your heart? As we go throughout this workshop, I want you to keep these memories close to you. Use them as a touchstone as you think about planning your work inside of schools or with youth. It will be important to always remember what it is like to be a young person as you craft your lessons. And I put this here because a lot of times I think the failure that happens when we're crafting lessons for young people is we forget what it's like to be a young kid inside of a classroom for 7 hours and having to sit in a seat and not being able to speak, always being told to sit still, and often, not having a lot of power. And it's important to remember that vulnerability as you begin to craft whether it's a digital resource or a lesson that you might be teaching. These are things that you want to keep in mind. So first, a little bit about who I am. Before I begin, I wanted to provide some brief background about who I am and some of my work and how that informs the way I think about teaching. So first, I'm a youth development professional. I have over 15 years of experience in various settings, teaching or coordinating programs in shelters, after-school programs, community centers, and traditional daytime classrooms. I've worked in DC, I'm from New York, I worked in New York, I've worked in Nashville, Tennessee, and now I'm in Nebraska, Lincoln, where I also teach in the high schools over here. I even once taught a poetry program in the ferry terminal in Staten Island. Second, I'm a writer. I have my MFA in fiction from Vanderbilt. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And as Lorena mentioned, I'm doing digital humanities there and ethnic studies, as well as a concentration in fiction. And lastly, I'm a digital humanist. And this is very recent. I recently began studying digital humanities a little bit over 2 years ago. And thanks to USLDH, I'm currently part of a large team of scholars working on creating a digital archive dedicated to Puerto Rican literature. So what? Who cares? Why is this important? I mention this because as educators, before we walk into a classroom, it's important to think about who we are and how our experiences shape the way we approach building or planning lessons. Not only do we want to think about what our values are, we also want to think about what are our assumptions, because sometimes we want to test those too. What are the things that we take for granted, and how do they inform how we teach? By doing this type of reflection, we can be more intentional as we shape curriculum. For example, as a youth development professional, because of my experience in youth and community development, I'm very interested in youth-centered programming. That means that I'm listening to young people and having them inform me what types of programs and lessons they want. This is something I think that all of you should think about when you're implementing different programs or creating curriculums or thinking about different tools. What do young people actually want? I'm interested in youth participation and engagement, highlighting and promoting the voices of young people, considering the whole child in addition to whatever academic goals I might have, and building a child's sense of community and civic engagement. And I just put a little note here that you can see that my experience, just to be transparent, my youth development experience, right, came through with that first exercise that we did. As a writer, I'm interested in thinking about the power that storytelling has in our everyday lives and in providing young people with the tools to tell their own stories with pride. When appropriate, I'm interested in helping them think about the different elements of telling a story: plot, point of view, characterization, and structure, building an appreciation for and love of language, helping young people advocate for themselves off the page and in real life situations. As a digital humanist, I'm interested in building digital literacy in the youth I'm working with, helping them to recognize, to quote my dear friend, Linda Garcia Merchant, that, quote, young people are constantly using the digital to document and editorialize their lives via platforms such as Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. I'm interested in using the digital to recover and promote underrepresented stories to young people and teaching youth how to access digital tools to tell their own stories. Oh, little typo over there. Okay, so now it's your turn. I want you to take 3 minutes to answer the following questions. Again, you can put this on paper, or you can, if you have a really good memory, you can meditate or reflect on it. But we're going to be actually going back to these reflections with exercise 1 and this one as well. What life experiences and accomplishments affect the way that you teach or aspire to show up in the classroom? Number 2. How do you want young people to feel after your class? This is an important one. Do you want them to feel excited? Do you want them to feel inspired? Do you want them to feel safe? These are things to think about as you craft your lessons. 3, what are 2 or 3 skills that you would like them to learn from you? So you probably have a whole, there's probably 10 or 15 of them, right? But I want you to really zero in and focus on 2 or 3. Because that makes it a little bit easier for later when we craft our lessons. So take about 2 to 3 minutes for this. This is a good time also to, if you joined late, to list 1 or 2 questions or topics that you're interested in covering in today's workshop, so that later when I'm looking through the chats, you can list it inside of the chat. I can make sure that we address some of the issues you're interested in. All right. So remember, keep these answers next to you so that we can go back to them a little bit later. All right, so before I begin any lesson or program or any type of school visit, I ask myself a whole big list of questions that I listed here for you. And oftentimes I'll set up some time to work with the teacher or the coordinator who invited me to do a workshop so that I can talk to them. These are the questions that you have to know before you walk in there. You want to know what setting you're working in. Is this an after school program, right? Have the kids been there for 7 hours? Now they're hungry, they're tired, they want to go home, and now they have to be in school for another 2 hours, right? Is this a shelter? I've done programs in shelters, right? And so that's important to recognize that that's, where a young person might, that's where they live, right? And so you want to be respectful of that as well. Or is this a traditional daytime classroom where you have these strict 40-minute periods and where you're going to be with a classroom teacher, right? Is this a virtual workshop? Is this over Zoom? Do the children have access to computers? Are they going to be, do they each have a computer in which they're logging into class with? Or are they going to be crowded around, a projector? Or will you be physically in the same room? Right? So there's pluses and negatives, right, for each of these settings. And it's good to know right away before you even start planning. Do these young people know each other? This seems like a question to take for granted, but it's an important one, right? Because if this is an after school program and it's a drop-in, say at a community center, sometimes you might have a group of kids who just decided to drop in, and it might be the first time they've ever met each other. And so you might want to leave some space to create an icebreaker or some low stakes exercises so that they can know each other before you get to the other lesson that you're working in. Is this a regularly meeting group of children and students? Then maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to do like an intro or icebreaker because they all know each other. You just have to introduce yourself. Number 3, who else will be in this room to help you facilitate? Are you bringing another teacher? Is the classroom teacher going to be there? Is it a coordinator? Is it a group leader? This is an important question as well. What access will each child have to a computer? I talked a little bit about this before. If you want them to learn how to use digital tools, and so this will really dictate how much you're trying to teach them, right? Because if they don't have a lot of access to individual computers, then you have to be strategic about what and how you're teaching them. It might be that you have 2 or 3 kids to 1 computer, right? And if they're younger, that might be a little bit difficult. So you want to bring in another person to help get them ready on the computer and to give them individual attention. Will the school or the community center set you up in a computer lab, right? If so, then that's great. Then you have a lot more freedom. If you're in a shelter, there may not be a computer lab, right? So these are things to think about. How many young people, students will be in your workshop? Does your project require one-on-one instruction? And how will you provide that if you have a larger group? If you have 25, 25 might be too much for 5th grade. It depends on the school you're at. But let's say you have 23 students. You can do different things with 23 students than what you can do with 10 students, for example, right? That's important to think about. How old are these students? Remember that the younger the age, the more you have to build smaller units of instruction, providing more opportunity for hands-on activities, because the attention span of younger students is smaller. Some of you who are parents know this already, right? So if if you're doing something with the 3rd grader, their attention span is going to be much less than an 11th grader, for example. What opportunities does your digital project provide that your students might not otherwise experience in their normal day-to-day life at school? How can you give them something special? This is so important. What do you offer that the school can't, right? And this goes to, I think it was Monica who had mentioned something in the chat about creating resources for elementary schools or high schools or middle schools. It's important to make sure that you're not just giving them the same thing, right? And so that means that you're talking to your teacher and you're also listening to young people. What do they want? What do they normally not have? And this last question I think is really important. A few years ago, I heard this crazy statistic. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's basically like throughout the school day, the average young person hears themselves speak like maybe 3 minutes or something like this. And which is, it's kind of crazy, right? Like you're told, and again, this is why it's important to think about what it was like to be young. You know, for 7 hours straight, you're told to sit down and be quiet, right? What does that do to a young person? And what happens when they can hear themselves or be able to speak or hear each other? Okay, so I'm going to go to an example project that I did to give you some ideas. So in this setting, this was an after-school program at a Cornerstone in Staten Island, New York City. It was funded by the Department of Youth and Community Development through a small grant for teenage youth. The actual program was called Teen Action. And so what you should know about Cornerstones are, these are community centers that are located in public housing throughout New York. There's a lot of them. And basically they're, rounds the clock services for young people and adults. This specific program was designed for young people ages 12 to 17. And we had a class size of 8 to 10. We had 2 teaching artists. One was a writer, me, and one a sound engineer and producer named Christian Penn of a program called Projectivity. And our program was designed because at this point in Stapleton, Staten Island, there had been a lot of shootings and there was a lot of violence. We wanted to give young people an opportunity to talk about violence and express themselves and what they cared about and what they feared through music. And so we were using computers. Christian had designed a program in which he was teaching them about sound engineering and how to produce their own beats. And I would work with them about to produce the actual writing for the songs. And so our standards or goals were to allow young people to express themselves artistically through music and to learn more about musical engineering. There was no need, and this is important. I'm going to show you an example of another project in which we had to align with Common Core, in which we have to align with Common Core. But for this program, we did not have to align for Common Core. And so this might be the case for some of your projects, but you'll still have to design curriculum and a strong lesson plan, right? So here's a sample lesson plan. These are some of the kids inside the program. They're so cute. And so here, we have, just so that you can see, lesson plans are basically built the same way. It varies sometimes from different schools or settings, but there are always these basic components, right? There's the material you bring in, the exercise, your objectives, right? And so for this one, for the Department of Youth and Community Development inside of New York, it usually looks like this, right? There's an objective, right? And so here to help participants think about home, while also building a larger conversation about violence in our communities. And to help participants learn the importance of using strong details to create setting. And so we have our materials, and we also have the things that we're going to cover, right? So we had different songs and poems. We had Wu-Tang's Cream, so because Wu-Tang came from Staten Island, and specifically these projects, they were from Stapleton and also another neighborhood, Park Hill. And so Cream sort of covers some of this violence, right? And it was a way by including that type of material, it's a way for young people to also relate to art that's made from their community, right? And see themselves inside of it. Other poems and songs we used were Jill Scott's Hate on Me, Willie Perdomo, he's a New Rican poet, his poem Where I'm From. And then Xavier Charles, I took that poem previously, and Xavier Charles was a young person I worked with who was 17 from Staten Island who did a version of this poem after Willie Perdomo. And so I would include that as well. Introductory, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too much in this because I'll send you guys examples of lesson plans, but I just want to give you a basic idea, right? So there's usually an introductory exercise, a main exercise, which was to draw a map of your neighborhood and draw the places you always go to, the places where you hang out. Draw the place where you first saw blood, the place where you were first hit, where you first hit someone, the place where you were first kissed. Place an X on somewhere that is beautiful. Draw a place that is ugly. Now pick one of those and write about them, right? And then we had people share work and we closed out. This is one example of a lesson that we did. Another prompt, and I'm going to show you an actual student product after this, was One prompt was to make a list of rules of survival. And so they could choose any topic, right? You could talk about how to survive turning 13, how to survive your parents getting divorced, how to survive braces, right? It could be something serious or something silly, right? And you would write for 15 minutes thinking of as many rules as possible. And one of my really talented young students, Rakim, he wrote a poem called How to Survive the Fifth Grade, and then we put it over music. I wrote it down over here, but I'm actually gonna play the final song and poem for you, and you can follow along with what's on the screen, because it's a little, he's a fifth grader, so it's, so we're still working on enunciation, but this was actually a really cool poem. So I'm gonna play it. And I'm gonna stop here. Can you guys hear, can somebody shout out? I can't see people's faces. Can you hear the recording?
Yes.
Perfect, all right, okay. I'm going to move this.
Fifth grade for boys. Rule number 1, make friends before they're all gone. Rule number 2, remember there's always going to be a bully, and the bully always have backup. Rule number 3, hope you get a substitute teacher most of the time if you don't like your regular teacher. Rule number 3, in the cafeteria, always sit at the same table every day or the bullies will take your seat. Rule number 4, if you start to feel lonely, get a girlfriend, treat her right. Rule number 5, on most of your senior trips, if you want to, sit next to your girlfriend. Rule number 6, if you have a phone and bring it to school and you are told to read a book, put the book on your lap, put your bookmark in your book, and put the phone in your book too. Don't forget to turn the volume down or off, and have fun and be sneaky with it.
Oh, and we loved this. And this is an example of how you can use the digital, and you can combine different types of disciplines to do something that's so exciting for a fifth grader, right? Who might not have access to a real music studio, right? To go create their own music and their own poetry. This is an example of something that could happen. Now, if I were to really push it further, I might work with, we did this project years ago, but I might, now that I have this experience in digital humanities, I might make a website with the kids, right? Have them write essays, maybe have them make digital maps for their Where I'm From poems, right? So there's so many different things that you can do. All right, so let's go move on to this part, which is I think is probably why a lot of folks were interested in this workshop, and that's a Common Core standard. So this is the Common Core standards could be very controversial. Lots of people, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, arguing, just do the Common Core standards work? Why do we have Common Core standards? Oh yes, the Common Core standards work, whatever, right? But basically some brief background and history. The Common Core standards were actually developed in Arizona as a response to the No Child Left Behind Act, because what was happening there was that, there was, with No Child Left Behind, there was such an emphasis on testing, right? And so then the argument was that because teachers and principals, they needed to make sure that their kids passed, that they were lowering the standards, right? And so folks started to get together to develop these standards in which they, you would be able to, across the country, agree on certain, objectives or goals for each grade. And these were developed for K through 12. One second, I gotta plug my computer. Of course it's gonna die while I'm doing this. But yeah, so that is the history of the Common Core standards. One thing to remember is that the standards are actually, they're just that, standards. They're not curriculum. And so I think that lots of times that gets confused for people. They think it's like a curriculum that's, or for parents, it's a curriculum that's given to teachers to actually use, but they're just goals, right? And so the first thing you want to do is actually check if your state or school uses them or if they're using other standards, right? So I provided this website over here. And if you click on it, this is corestandards.org. Green are the states that use the standard, so depending on where you are, that will be applicable. In Texas, if you're in Texas, they don't use the Common Core standards. They use actually a different set. And if you do a soft Google search, that'll come up right away, like I found it right away. They have different standards that they use inside the public schools, right? So that's the first thing you want to do. Do I need to actually align to Common Core? And if you're working inside of a community center, that might not even be an issue, but for schools, public schools, they might have to have certain expectations that they have to meet. All right, let me go back to my PowerPoint real quick. Okay, cool. After you find out if your state is using the Common Core standards, now you want to familiarize yourself with the standards, all right? And so the same website, you get over here. I'm gonna admit Joshua, there we go. You click over here, and if you go to explore the Common Core, you can actually see what those different standards are. I don't know why it's not clicking. There we are. Read the standards. And depending, let's say, for example, we're doing English language, right? I click on that. And then on the right side of the page in this menu, you can look at, it's divided into different sections or components, you know, reading literature, reading informational text, which would be nonfiction, reading foundational skills, so for kids who are actually just learning, right, phonetics and how to sound out words, writing, speaking, and listening. And you can click on these things and go to the specific grade that you're interested in, right? So if I'm doing a program in 9th grade, I can click on that, and it lists everything for me. So let's look at integration of knowledge and ideas. This standard right here, analyze the representation of a subject or a key scene in 2 different artistic mediums, including what is emphasized or absent in each treatment, right? This is a 9th grade standard. So we might look at a project like I just did with the community center and think, okay, we can look at the themes that are being covered with this Wu-Tang song, right? And the themes that are covered inside of poetry, right? Willie Perdomo's poem, right? And that would mean that your project would satisfy this goal. I'm gonna go back because I wanna show you a lesson. Okay, well, before I do that, you want to, after you familiarize yourself with the standards, you want to identify the goals of your project, all right? And so this is why this is a good time to look at your previous exercises that helped you shape this list. So what is my mission as a teacher, right? And what are the 2 or 3 things that I want these students to learn? And how do I want them to feel after this? So for example, Rakim, who wrote that poem about being in 5th grade, he was so proud when he saw it, like he heard himself, right? Because it sounded like it's a song, it's recorded, it's something, we made CDs, he could bring it home and show it to his friends. Try to think about how your students want to feel and design projects that get them there. After you've done this 3rd step, you want to plan backwards using those goals, right? And so when we say plan backwards, and probably a lot of you are familiar with this because a lot of you are teachers in higher ed, right? But you look at, okay, so if I want to teach them plot, or if I want to teach them the different components of a poem, or if I want to teach them to use this digital tool, then I'll need to teach them A, B, and C. So the second lesson that I'm going to use as an example before we break into Q&A is one that I designed for the Puerto Rican Literature Project. And we haven't done this one yet, but we're really excited. So the Puerto Rican Literature Project, just some brief background, is a digital archive of Puerto Rican literature that includes, will include spatial visualizations. I'm also working on a neat line map that is tracing literary production over the last century since the Jones Act. And so our goal was to create lessons using this digital archive and provide teachers with resources. This goes back to that question that I think Monica had mentioned, you know, about creating resources for teachers that they can use to teach to use the archive inside their classrooms. And for this purpose, if I were thinking about, so New York does follow the Common Core. So I thought about high schools, right? And I put 1, 2, 3, 4, let's see, there's 4 Common Core standards here that I listed. The first one is that this project will have young people write narratives to develop real and or imagined experiences or events using effective technique, well-chosen details, and well-structured event sequences. They're going to use narrative techniques such as dialogue, pacing, description, reflection, and multiple plot lines to develop experiences, events, and/or characters. They're going to use a variety of techniques to sequence events, right? So one after another, so that they build on one another to create a coherent whole. They're going to use precise words and phrases, telling details in sensory language to convey a vivid picture of the experiences, events, setting, and/or characters. And the historical topics we would be covering are the Nuyorican poetry movement, the 1937 Palm Sunday Massacre, and the Ponce Massacre, Operation Bootstrap, and 1950s migration. So this is usually, for this type of lesson, we list these objectives and these standards at the top. Now you can move in to more detail, right? So our objectives: students will explore their own personal histories and origin stories through digital mapping and poetry, right? So this is that digital component. Students will be introduced to the digital archive and learn how to access its resources. Students will learn about the events that led to the Puerto Rican migration to New York City in the 50s. The poems that we're going to be covering are Miguel Piñero's La Bodega Soul Dreams, Pedro Pietri's Puerto Rican Obituary, and Willie Perdomo's Where I'm From. And I also included, remember I mentioned Xavier Charles, he had written the poem after, and so here's an example of a poem that I would include by a young person. Xavier writes, "There's 4 buildings and friends in every one, with the jungle gym in the circle, occasionally stained with blood. I wake up to the smell of pine saw and my mama dancing to music that speaks straight to the soul. Egg sandwiches and Cartoon Network, Saturday morning. Strangers from 65 crying and tearing, Saturday morning." Xavier loved this. He was like, look at that morning and morning. Look at this. "Last night's murder must have hit her hard, but we carry out our days, little to no regard. Riding our bikes to the store only to not buy nothing. Telling peers I had so much when we was all frontin'. Talking to the drug dealers, not knowing what they do. Hoping my mom don't hear me when I ask my friends for food." And so this is another poem I would include inside of this lesson. So the second section, right? And I just wanted to give you an idea of what the archive looks like now, where we actually just got a new logo. So I have to change this. And we're working with this brilliant Omeka designer that USLDH connected us with, who's going to, make our site even prettier. But this is what the archive looks like right now. It's basically an Omeka site. And here's an example of a digital timeline from the 60s, tracing literary production next to historical events. So I wanted to give you this as an example as we look through to the left side of this. So again, we have that planning ahead component in the lesson plan, print out copies of poems to distribute, or teaching online, have them ready to share on screen. Make sure to have access to computer and projector to share digital timeline and provide tour of Puerto Rican Literature Project archive. There's some pre-writing, right? And notice I'm using the same mapping exercise because it works. It works for a 5th grader. It also works for high schoolers. And I would say when we talk about college students, it works for college students also. It's one of these exercises that is so powerful. All right. Here's another image from our archive. This is a picture of Jorge Brandon. He was a foundational Nuyorican poet. And this picture is by Marlis Momber. It's in New York in 1983. This is actually Marlis Momber's son, I believe. And here's an example of another sample poem that we would do. And this one is dedicated. This one is about the massacre, the Ponce massacre. And if you know anything about Jorge Brandon, he left PR after that to escape because basically it was like he was in trouble of getting arrested, so he came to New York. This is the mapping exercise we talked about. I also have students read aloud their free writes, right? And wait, hold up, you guys' faces are blocking this. And I also encourage other students to point out the lines, images, or metaphors that resonated with them. So all of this is the idea is that all of this pre-writing would lead to the digital, right? Which it kind of reminds me, Linda, who's here, would always say, do stuff in analog first, and then we can go to digital, right? Like, so map it out. And this is very similar in writing, I feel like. And so we'll have the students write, and then we can move to think about how we can visualize that in a digital setting. And always you want to have a check-in or assessment. You want to ask yourself, did students generate a draft, right? So this is about evaluation. Were students able to locate imagery in the model poems in each other's writing? Were students engaged? And be honest with yourself. This might hurt, right? And I've led lessons where the students weren't engaged, but you have to be honest. And that's, as a teacher, you have to note when you have failed, right? So this is an important step. You have to ask yourself, were they actually interested? Did they volunteer to read? Did they offer feedback to their peers? And then the final section of the lesson is your follow-up steps, right? What are the next steps of this project when we come in for the curriculum? And I know I'm running, actually we're doing great, good. This is my last slide. And then we can talk and open it up, because I know there's a lot of great educators in here, and we can help each other think about this and answer each other's questions. To tailor this for the college classroom, I don't know if I'm in the minority over here, but I actually think teaching college is easier than teaching fifth graders or middle schoolers or high schoolers, mostly because college students want to be there most of the time. I mean, their parents are paying for it, or they're going back to school. And so it's a little bit easier, right? And they're a little bit older, so there's more that you can do. But what I would say is that you can often take the same project and goals, but just dig deeper into the skills and technologies you're presenting, right? So it's not that you have to change your whole project, it's that you just do more with the same project, right? For example, in a college level classroom, you might dig deeper into the creation of metadata. You might help students build their own digital exhibit about where they're from. That might include interviews from family and community members, pictures that they took of their neighborhood, maybe songs or art. You can also widen the amount of responsibility and give them more independence to work alone. And lastly, you can provide more theoretical readings and craft projects that align with departmental missions or sets of goals. And so a lot of these projects that I showed before could be tailored for older students. So I'm going to stop here because I want to have some time for questions and to talk about, I see we have so much in the chat. This is great. To talk about, to brainstorm together about some of the issues that have been brought up in the chat. I think, is it Lorena or somebody's going to go through the chat and pose the questions, and then we can go from there. But thank you, guys.
So right now, if anybody wants to go ahead and post any questions, you can do so. I'll just I think right now, mainly we have some of the topics that they're hoping we can talk about. Let me find them. How to incorporate digital projects into digital resources in K through 12 classrooms.
We talked a little bit about that. Yeah, I think that was Monica's question.
How to encourage movements such as dance, yoga, singing, etc. in the classroom, as well as within the curricula in general.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes. There's a lot of things with that, and we can open it up because we have a lot of educators in this room as well. But there's an emphasis, at least where I was in New York, to do a lot of yoga, dance. I mean, there's things about, for example, impulse control, right? How yoga can help with impulse control. And for some students who may have a lot, of emotion that's actually manifests itself physically, right? And they react. And sometimes you can see when a child is so angry, they kind of like, they're trembling, right? And it's like, and you'll see those same kids, like they love yoga, right? And so I think that this is such an excellent question. But I think it's this, it's like sort of with the musical engineering project, you can incorporate these different art forms. So for example, what if we did, let's say it's a middle school class you're working with. What if you had middle schoolers teach other middle schoolers yoga through video or a website, right? And then it's like they're teaching their other young people, right? Or they're talking about what this does for their bodies or makes them feel well. And there you have like this youth empowerment and this youth engagement that's happening. I would say that you should also, for any project like this, you want to work with the teacher and the young people and see what they're interested in doing, right? Yeah, but that's a great question. And if anybody else has any thoughts about this, they can jump in.
Okay, if anyone wants to jump in, feel free to do so either in the chat or unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can go ahead and move on to the next question. Maria wants to get some ideas on using DH in the college level Spanish classroom. So Spanish as a second language. So maybe we can think about just in general language learning classes, English, Spanish, or any other language.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And actually, I think because Lorena, Caro, and Gabby are here, this is, I mean, they've been doing this work forever, like incorporating languages and into archives. So I'm interested in what they're thinking about. For us at the Puerto Rican Literature Project, we're very interested in doing bilingual, so Spanish, English, and also Spanglish, right? So we have descriptions written in Spanish, we have descriptions written in English, we have poetry. We hired a whole translation team to, to translate key poems into both languages, right? And so that was something that was a real priority for us because we wanted to sort of connect the diaspora and the archipelago. That's one thing that we're doing, but I'm actually interested in hearing about USLDH's experience with this. Whoever wants to go, don't jump.
Yeah.
I was trying to looking for the mute button. I've been using it so much I completely forgot where it is. But so I think one thing that I want to think about, like with language, is a lot of times we use language like as a resource, right, to translate into it, to make things available. But I like for recovery how we part from like centering language, right? For us, it's like about centering, making sure that people know that a lot of these materials were first written in Spanish, and then we part from there. Because that like shifts things around, because all of a sudden you're thinking, what, like people are writing in Spanish in the US and they're writing, they're working like intellectually, at a different level. So from that, I think just like the fact that you're producing something in Spanish already is really powerful. But I think I saw this really great project out of New York that a teacher is doing in their classes at CUNY University. They've taken, like in the Spanish classes, they've incorporated like the US Latino subject, and how does that person navigate the world around them, which is, I think Linda also has a project about that, like learning your city through your environment, like, right, you get to define your own city, but this one, you define your environment as a Latino. And what does that Latino see? What is the language that they're, do they go to a bodega? Do they go to a groceria? Do they go to la tienda, right? And is it la tienda or el super? And so then students are starting to like develop like new language skills around the language that they use on a daily basis, because that's what like the argument is. Latinos in the US practice language or engage with language in a very different way than we do it in other places, right? It is to communicate. And so if I have to say, like my beautiful niece was teaching me yesterday how to play in Roblox, and they were using tradear, to trade. And she was like, see, she was speaking perfectly everything in Spanish until she came to trade. And she said, mira, tía, ¿puedes tradearme un animal? And I was like, oh, okay. And so, but all the kids were writing that. And I thought, how wonderful, right? And we don't have like the adult there telling them that's not how you do it. But I think that's an example that I would use. I didn't, Caro, do you have anything for USLDH?
I'm so sorry, but I need to run to another meeting. I was just writing that.
All right, that's it.
Sorry.
Maybe we can pull in the next question and kind of integrate it into this. I'm curious to learn more about integrating archives and primary artifacts in the classroom. both K through 12 and higher ed?
Marco! I love Marco. That's a good question, Marco. Okay, so here's something, and I mean, we ended up we got a big grant for the Puerto Rican Literature Project. You know, USLDH worked with us day and night for it. And one of the things we wanted to do was have an educational component, but we ended up having to do it for the second phase of funding. And this is what I love this question, because this is actually my dream, right? Which is that I would use like the lesson that I showed you all, but also I would, from what the young people produced, I would incorporate that into the archive, right? So that we have this way in which the archive just isn't this, like, for me, decolonizing the archive is also taking it, reframing it as just something that's in the past, right? It's something that generates new work and new communities and helps young people create new work. And if they're writing after poems about Willie Perdomo, right? And then we include that as part of our archive, what is being, the subtext there is that your work is valuable. You are an artist and you are part of this history making. And that for me was, you know, that for me would be the exciting part, is, you know, that this is not just something that's of the past, but that it's incorporating new voices and it's helping engage more people to, you know, participate. Oh, thank you, Monica. That's so
Gabby wants, oh, great. All right, so Monica says, these lessons are incredible, Claire. Do the students get short lessons on the histories of the massacres, or do they learn mostly from the literature? I never thought about how important it is to create opportunities for students to hear themselves and develop self-expression skills.
Yeah, we have, so this is a project that I've been planning, but I haven't done the parts of the curriculum of the Ponce Massacre and Jorge Brandon, but I'm really excited to get in there, because what I know from education inside of the States is that these are histories that have been denied to, you know, I grew up in Brooklyn and Staten Island, and I never learned about the Ponce Massacre, right? And for me, you know, and I never learned about a lot of the history of that brought my parents here, you know, this type of circular migration between the island and the States. And so I think that one entranceway, and maybe this is something I need to evaluate with myself. Remember, we were talking about assumptions. I get really excited about art. Like as a child, I learned things through art, through music, through poems, and that was my way in. And so for me, like starting with a poem by Brandon, or starting with a song, or starting with a video of a contemporary poet reading, you know, Beatriz' Puerto Rican obituary, that for me is an entrance into those topics, because they, you know, it makes, you know, the young person actually feel those things, instead of me saying in 1930 something this happened, in 1953 this happened, you know, I can do that afterwards. But I want to, you always use the entrance to be something that's dynamic and interesting and exciting. Yeah, that Monica said, absolutely gets them to the historical significance and why it matters. Yeah. Well, I think that's actually it for questions inside the chat. If anybody has any other questions, you're welcome to reach out to me. And but I'm also here to, if we need to stay for a few more minutes, you know, I'll stick around. But I think, is there any other questions, Lorena, that you saw that we missed?
I don't see any more questions unless anyone else has questions or comments that they want to share. I know we also understand that you might have other meetings or classes that you need to run to, so that's fine. So we'll just stay a few minutes afterwards.
Can I just say one more thing, Lore? Claire, thank you so much, because I think this is so powerful. For me, I think one thing that is outstanding in this you know, in the way you presented like the lesson plan, is that we can see how really like the digital humanities can allow us to bring a lot of different elements together, right? So it just makes it a little more dynamic for the students, especially for those students that may be reticent about doing like the you know, like the extra activity, or like the more engaging activity. Like Roselia, you know, mentioned about dance and, you know, and exercise. So we have, like, you give them a variety of options. I really like that. And I like the way it's set up and how, you know, we're able to think about in the long run, like in long term, like what are all the different elements that we can put to really like fully execute like a lesson that can be engaging to all students at different levels. I think that I'm grateful to you for that. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you all.